You know, the word honeymoon is a wonderful word. Just the word conjures up warm feelings and pleasant memories. In fact, my wife and I, we married, it'll be 43 years ago in about 2 weeks. At that time, almost everybody in Middle Tennessee went to Panama City Beach on their honeymoon. Almost everybody did. So we did too. We just did what everybody else did. We're like lemmings. And so we went to Panama City Beach too. But so here's what I want to do. I want to ask you at the count of 3, shout out where you spent your honeymoon, okay? We spent ours in Panama City Beach. So at the count of 3, shout out where you spent your honeymoon. 1, 2, 3. Somebody said bed. That's naughty. But that's great. I wanted you to be thinking about your honeymoon. That's just great. I've read several definitions of the word honeymoon. Here's one. A honeymoon is the thrill of a lifetime. You didn't like that? It gets worse. Here's another one. A honeymoon is the period between I do and you'd better. A honeymoon is the vacation a man takes before starting to work for a new boss. Do you know the origin of the word? And you may say, why is he talking about this? Well, you'll see in a minute. Do you know the origin of the word honeymoon? Does anybody know what it means, the origin? At first service, don't you say anything. It literally comes from the concept of describing the first moon or the first month of a marriage. So the first moon of a month, first month of a marriage, so that's the sweetest and best time in a marriage. Then the honeymoon, literally that's where the term comes from. But for every marriage, there comes a point when the honeymoon ends. It's supposed to be the first month or whenever it is, but sometimes it's the first minute. Honestly, I've seen it. A couple where it's the first minute. But at some point it ends. In fact, one man observed the honeymoon is over when he phones that he'll be late for dinner and she's already left a note that it's in the refrigerator. Another one said the honeymoon is over when your dog brings you your slippers and your wife barks at you. So a little bit of truth there probably too. People talk about love at first sight. And I think some people do experience love at first sight. I really do. But I am much more impressed by love at the 18,250th sight. You know how many days 18,250 are? 50 years. That's 50 years. I'm much more impressed by the people who have love at 18,250 days than just love at first sight. Almost anybody can make it through a honeymoon period. But I love those folks who've been married 50 years and they have woken up and looked at the person next to them for 50 years, 18,250 days, and they still love them. Because when you've been married 50 years, you see the good and the bad. You see the sweet and the sour. You see, real love is not as exciting as it is enduring. You know how I know that? Because the greatest definition of love ever given is in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And there are 11 characteristics that are given there between verses 4 and 8. And the very last of those characteristics says, love is, or love never fails. Love never fails. It's enduring. It's love for the long haul. That's what I'm impressed with. And yet we all know the sad truth that marital love can grow stale. Love can get lost in the commotion of life. Love can begin well, but that doesn't mean it will bloom well. It certainly doesn't mean it'll end well. And such was the case with our text this morning, Isaac and Rebekah. At first, it seemed like their honeymoon would never end, but it did. Now, you remember Isaac. He was the promised son to Abraham and Sarah. In fact, God promised Abram in Genesis chapter 12 that he was going to start a third covenant with his people because the first two had failed. And this was going to be called the Abrahamic covenant, and he was going to build a nation out of his family. And Abraham says, what? I don't even have any children. And he says, no, I'm going to build a family, a whole nation out of your family. And Abraham and Sarah wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait for 30 years. Finally, when Abraham's 100 years old and Sarah is 90 years old, they have this one child, Isaac, that is going to be the father of many nations. And his descendants are going to be God's special people, a divine tribe. Isaac was one of the patriarchs of Israel, one of God's few chosen. And he followed in his father Abraham's steps, in good ways and in bad ways. Let's talk, for instance, about the bad way that will come out in our passage this morning. Do you remember in the Bible when Abraham took his wife Sarah to Egypt, and Sarah was a knockout? She was just a real beauty. But Abraham was afraid he was going to get knocked off because she was such a knockout. And so Abraham said, honey, I want you to lie to the Egyptians and say you're my sister. And so he did, because he was afraid they were going to kill him to take his wife. And so here's the first example of a problem in a marriage. To save his own skin, he threw his wife under the bus instead of trusting God. And it wasn't a one-time occurrence for Abraham. He did that in Egypt. Then the Bible tells us he did it a second time in Gaza. We hear a lot about the Gaza Strip today. That's the area where Abraham did that a second time. But apparently, it had become a lifestyle for Abraham. We've only heard about it in those two times directly in the Bible, Egypt and Gaza. But Genesis 20:13 says, Abraham said, when God called me to leave my father's home and to travel from place to place, I told Sarah, do me a favor. Wherever we go, tell the people that I'm your brother. What? Apparently it had become his habit. Parents, pay close attention. Isaac, now the only child of Abram and Sarah, he grows up. His family makes a trip to Gaza. Guess what he says to Rebekah, his wife? Honey, you're so beautiful, and I fear for my life. Lie to them and tell them you're my sister. He follows exactly in the footsteps of his father. It's a scary thought, but every parent better start thinking about it. Your habitual sins are contagious. Your habitual sins are as contagious as the coronavirus. Abram lied. Isaac, his son, came along, told the exact same lie. Exact same deceit in the exact same place. You see, children imitate what they see, not what they hear. Children do what they see, not what they are told. And that's what happened with Isaac. Now, here's something interesting. I've always found this fascinating. It wasn't until Sarah died that Abraham decided to search for Isaac a wife. Apparently, they'd just previously been one little happy family of three. But when Sarah slipped away into death, Isaac slipped into a funk. He was depressed, and Abraham knew, I need to get him a wife. And so he sent his servant Eleazar to his family 500 miles away in Haran to seek out a wife for Isaac. And Genesis chapter 24 records what happened there. When Eleazar the servant reached Haran, he decides to pray. And he thinks, how am I going to find a wife for Isaac and then drag her back 500 miles? So he says, I'm going to trust and depend on the Lord completely. And so he begins to pray, Lord, I've got all these camels with me. I've got 10 camels with me. And so the first woman Lord, I pray, that walks up and offers to help me and to water my camels from the journey, I think that will be an indication she might be a good choice. She might be a good pick. She might be a sacrificial one that would be good for your servant Isaac. And he barely finishes his prayer when Rebekah walks up and says, Sir, can I help you with your camels? Now, you got to understand something here. Camels are large animals. They'd been on a long trip. I'm sure you know that camels drink 25 gallons of water at one sitting. In fact, I'm quite sure there's nobody in this room that knew that. But you can look it up. That's 250 gallons of water. And she wasn't running over to BJ's or Publix and loading up the water like you do whenever there's a crisis. She was going to have to draw it from a well and this is going to be a day or two job. A big, big job. Any woman who would even attempt such a kindness would be a giving, sacrificial, unselfish, energetic young lady. A very fine catch for Isaac. Now understand, she had never seen Isaac. She'd only heard about him from the servant. But when her family hears this story about what Eleazar had prayed and about what she had done, even her family says, this is from the Lord. This is of the Lord. And so she begins to make this 500-mile trip. Do you understand what 500 miles was like then? It wasn't like today where we would go out here to Southwest Regional Airport and catch Delta and land on their hub in Atlanta, which is about 550 miles from here. No, it's a long, hard trip by camel. And so she goes on this trip, and I'm sure from Haran to Judah was an exciting one as she's asking Eleazar questions about Isaac, the groom. And what happened when they get there? It was, my friends, love at first sight. When Rebekah looked up and saw Isaac, she quickly dismounted from her camel. Who is that man walking through the fields to meet us? She asked the servant. Eleazar replied, it is my master. So Rebekah covered her face with her veil. Then the servant told Isaac everything he had done, and Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, and she became his wife, and he loved her deeply, and she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother. Now, before we go much further in the biblical story, in the biblical account, I want to say some things here. There was no question Isaac and Rebekah loved each other. In fact, some 40 years later, we're told that the Philistine king saw Isaac smooching with his wife. In fact, Genesis 26:8 says they were caressing. 40 years later, these lovebirds had been married 40 years, and the fire was still burning. There was still plenty of passion. In fact, it turns out when Rebekah was barren, she couldn't have children. And you understand what a big problem this is? This is no minor problem. This is a big problem. God has promised to build an entire nation out of Isaac. He told Abram, I will make a nation out of you. Abram only had the one child, the miracle child Isaac. And now Isaac has to have children. He has to have children, and Rebekah's barren. And when they found out she was barren, Isaac did the very best thing he could possibly do for his wife. And husbands, this is one of the very best things you could ever do for your wife. He prayed. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. And the Lord answered Isaac's prayer. And Rebekah became pregnant with twins. So there was a bond physically, even 40 years later. There was a bond spiritually. Isaac prayed for his wife. God answered the prayer. But emotionally, all after this time, there's a distance, and we see it in chapter after chapter of the Bible. What began as love at first sight slowly evolved into love at first sight. And there were a lot of slights that came. I mean, I can't prove this one is just opinion, but the first slight seems to me, remember when Isaac took Rebekah to be his wife and he brought her into his mother Sarah's tent and she became his wife? Sarah's tent? Ladies, how would you feel if your newlywed husband wanted to spend his wedding night in your dead mother-in-law's bedroom? That's pretty creepy. I know how my wife would have felt about that. I'm quite certain about that. Isaac had been close to his mom. It's possible, even probable, she had been overprotective of her only child. It's likely, from what we know about Isaac in the scripture, that her mothering love had become a smothering love. And that she had become what we know about in this day and age, or hear about in this day, one of those helicopter parents. And she sheltered Isaac from many of life's hardships. And so instead of growing to be a man and learning how to really stand on his own 2 feet, Isaac never fully recognized his potential. He's kind of the forgotten patriarch, really. He is. I mean, giving birth to Jacob and Esau was important, but other than that, he's really a little unimportant. And you see, the text says that she not only lived in his mother's tent, but she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother. Do you know how often it is men marry their mothers? I mean, there's a whole psychology built around it. I'm not saying you did. I'm just saying there's a whole psychology built around it. In a sense, Rebekah took the place of Sarah in Isaac's life. She was a talented and capable woman. It was easy for Isaac to capitulate leadership to Rebekah, just as he had done with Sarah. You could infer from this and what's going to happen in the future that rather than be his wife, Rebekah mothered Isaac. And you don't have to infer this, you know this from Scripture. Over time, Isaac became the passive husband for whom Rebekah lost respect. And Rebekah became the manipulating wife from whom Isaac withdrew further and further every year. You know, I've known couples that believe they've had marriage problems and they believe they could just have a baby and that would solve all their problems. That usually really reveals their problems rather than solves it. And Rebekah's pregnancy was difficult, and she couldn't understand why. Here's this promised child, and she couldn't understand why her pregnancy was so difficult, so the Lord told her, in answer to her prayer, the sons in your womb will become 2 nations. From the very beginning, the 2 nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. Now, that's out of order. If you know anything about the Jewish system, the older son was the one who would receive the birthright and the blessing and the majority of the estate and the property. Your older son will serve your younger son. And of course, that prophecy was fulfilled with the birth of Jacob and Esau. But what's provocative about this story in this text, or any of the text that follows, is that apparently Rebekah never told Isaac this. In fact, she continued to hide it from him, according to the text, all the way to his deathbed. My point is, Isaac and Rebekah had apparently stopped talking. They ceased communicating. Even about the important stuff, they had grown distant. There's a story in Reader's Digest about a couple who raised and pickled cucumbers. And the husband, and they did this for nearly 50 years, and the husband liked to watch things grow, so he took care of the planting, and the wife liked to work in the kitchen, so she did the pickling. And when the man died, the kids came over to help plow the garden. And their mom said, look, guys, I appreciate your helping, but no thanks. I never really liked cucumbers. I only pickled them because your dad wanted to grow them. And the children suddenly had this look of horror come over their face. And the youngest son said, well, Mom, that's just not true. A few days before Dad died, he told us the only reason he planted the garden was to give you something to do in the kitchen, and he thought you loved pickling the cucumbers. Now, on the one hand, it's commendable that they were each willing to go to that degree of sacrifice for the other, and they put the other first. But on the other hand, it's pitiful because they never communicated what they really felt to each other, and they spent 50 years wasting money, time, effort, because they wouldn't talk to one another about how they really felt. Husbands, when you come home from work and you say you're too tired to talk to your wife or too busy, or you leave the impression, you don't say it, but you leave the impression you just don't care enough anymore, you are withdrawing from your wife just as Isaac did. When you come home from work and you don't know how to express your feelings and you don't even try, you are withdrawing from your wife just as Isaac did. And if you're too tired, my suggestion would be save some energy for the most important relationship in your life. And if you're too busy, I'd say make some time for the most important relationship in your life. And if you just don't care enough anymore, I would say repent of your sin. And as Ephesians 5 says, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And if you just don't know how to talk, learn how to do it. There are ways to learn how to do it. And if you don't learn how to talk well, at least listen well. Be a good listener, and that alone will open up important lines of communication with your wife. Did you know that one of the most reputable marriage firms said that 70% of marriage problems have as one of their primary components a silent, withdrawing husband? 70% have as a big problem in the marriage a silent, withdrawing husband. You see? Watch this. Because it's happened with Isaac and Rebekah. The more the man withdraws, the less secure the woman feels, and the more she tries to manipulate him to gain control. And the more she tries to gain control, the more he withdraws and does his own thing and withdraws even further. And this vicious cycle sets up and gets created. And you could call it love at first sight. And the bitterness and the disappointment starts to snowball, and walls go up instead of bridges being built, and communication becomes almost impossible. And before you know it, holy wedlock has become unholy deadlock. That is exactly what happened with Isaac and Rebekah, both of them. I talked about husbands and Isaac. A wife who's kept at a distance often resorts to manipulation and in subtle ways tries to force her husband into doing what she wants him to do. She may do that by withholding certain privileges or becoming silent herself on the other side. There's a number of ways she can do that. It's kind of like the fellow who said, I wouldn't say that my wife always gets her way, but she does write her diary a week in advance. Some of you will get that a little later. First service was quicker than you. They laughed, didn't they? Yeah, they did. And for some wives, it's become such a habit, they don't realize they're doing it because they've seen mom do it or they've seen their friends do it, and they no longer see that they are doing it. Listen, if you've become a manipulator, it's time you stopped. If you become like Rebekah, it's time you stopped and trusted God to guide your husband. You don't have to be in control when God holds the reins. The marriage of Isaac and Rebekah began with love at first sight, and then it had a series of slights that moved it to spite. And this friction soon became evident in the whole family. I mean, if this family, Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau, if this family were in today's society, we would have them as a textbook case on all the TV shows as a dysfunctional family. Because it was dysfunction all the way through it. Every one of them, dysfunctional. And Isaac and Rebekah created it by the way they treated each other and by the way they treated their children. Each of them sought emotional attachment through their kids. Each of them had a favorite child. The Bible says it straight out. Isaac's favorite child was Esau. He was a hunter. He was a man's man. He was a tough guy. Isaac saw in him what he had never been but wanted to be. But his mother Sarah had not let him. And so he lived out his own failed ambitions through his son Esau. Whereas Jacob was Rebekah's favorite, and she said it straight out, and she coddled him, and she kept him around the house. That's what the Bible says. She kept him at home. Jacob loved to cook and cross-stitch and do floral arrangements. I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but not by too much. Both of them had favorites, and favoritism among children can be fatal because they know it. They see it. They recognize it. I've heard it 100 times. And Isaac and Rebekah were stone cold guilty. They remind me of the couple that were on their way home from Aunt Emma's funeral. And Emma had been a handful, and every family has one. She was an obstinate old lady who tortured the family for years. Nobody liked her. And finally she died. And on the way home, the husband turned to his wife and said, "Honey, I hate to say it. I shouldn't say it. I apologize in advance. But I'm actually glad your Aunt Emma kicked the bucket." And she looked over at him with a look of horror and said, "My Aunt Emma? I thought she was your Aunt Emma." They had made a big mistake because they failed to communicate. Communication breakdowns will destroy a family. They will. So, you know what happens next. You know the story. We first learned it in Sunday school. Most all of us did. When the moment came for Isaac to bestow the blessing on the firstborn, that seems like it would have been an opportune time for Rebekah to tell her husband the truth, wouldn't it? But she didn't. That ship had sailed. And the result of slight after slight after slight now is a show of spite. Isaac goes to bless Esau, but Rebekah the manipulator has clothed Jacob in a furry disguise. She's made him feel hairy like Esau. She's also taken advantage of his diminished eyesight. So she passes off Jacob for Esau and helps Jacob, her youngest son, fool her own husband and tricks him. And Rebekah knew that God intended to bless the younger Jacob over the older Esau. And I'm sure she thought she was helping God out. My goodness, do you know how many times we mess up when we think we are helping God out? Do you know something? God does not need your help to do His will. And I'm sure she thought that. But when it comes to God's will, the end never justifies the means. Can I say that again? When it comes to God's will, the end never justifies the means. You can't do bad means to get to a good end and think it's from God. God's purposes are fulfilled through love and truth, not manipulation and deception. And so and here's the irony of all this dysfunction. Because of Rebekah, Esau ends up enraged. He vows to kill his twin brother. Jacob runs for his life, and Rebekah never sees her favorite son, Jacob, again for the rest of her life. Do you know how many times I've seen that in manipulating families? How many instances I could tell you right now? Children not speaking to parents, parents not speaking to children. Because of this kind of dysfunction, often caused by a lack of truth, honesty, and communication. And so the problems in Isaac and Rebekah's marriage spill over and absolutely destroy what should have been and could have been a happy family. There are so many lessons to learn from this, but I've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I've got to get to the main lesson to learn from this. And the main lesson to learn from this is like Ephesians 4:15 says, we must speak the truth in love. You can't speak the truth in hate. That'll lead to dysfunction. You can't lie in love. That'll lead to dysfunction. You have to speak the truth in love. Now, God spoke this primarily to the church family, and it's also true in the church. But it applies the same in marriage and in the nuclear family. Truth doesn't ignore love, and love doesn't ignore truth. And when I say communication, I'm not talking about just an emotional rant from time to time. Venting or dumping isn't exactly healthy communication. Effective communication puts ourselves in the other person's shoes. I'm not always successful at it, but I always try to put myself in the other person's shoes and say, how are they feeling about this? How are they thinking about this in light of their circumstances, the way they were raised, the way they were taught, the way they think, the circumstances going on in their lives right now. We speak the truth, but we do it in a loving, considerate way. So let me make a couple of quick applications as we close of what could be many applications. The lesson husbands learn from Isaac is get off your duff and re-enter the marriage. Re-engage your wife. Communicate with your wife. Speak the truth in love. Your wife needs to know your thoughts. She needs to feel the emotional support that comes from caring communication. No excuse justifies a husband barricading his emotions or bailing out on his wife. A loving leader has to learn how to communicate. And it may not be easy, but it has to be done lest we create Isaac and Rebekah situations. And to the wives, Rebekah's example teaches that a woman only hurts herself and her children when she seeks to manipulate her husband. She had failed marriage, lost the child she loved the most, never saw him again. Trust God with your husband or you will end up messing up your family. Manipulation mars a family. It creates problems that are in the present, but that really surface in the future, and problems you live to regret. See, people with good marriages are those who connect not just physically. Isaac and Rebekah were still 40 years later doing that. And not even just spiritually. I'm sure they went to the altar. I'm sure they went to church. But also emotionally. The willingness to communicate is the key to a good marriage. And if you don't, love at first sight easily becomes not love at the first and second and third and fourth and fifth and so on slight, and eventually becomes full-blown spite. Everybody in here knows that. Because everybody in here knows circumstances or situations. You have them in your family, you've seen them in your church, or you've seen them in your workplace or in your neighborhood, where what looked like love at first sight has ended in horrific spite. And Isaac and Rebekah tell us why it happened and how we can avoid it. And we want to avoid it in the church family just like we want to avoid it in our homes, in our regular families as well. So God, give us the courage and the faith to do that.